Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar, Ukraine's Cultural Renaissance, How to Keep It Going. My name is Olesya and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We are a registered charity and we work to broaden knowledge about Ukraine and Ukrainians in the UK and beyond. And we do this by organizing events such as this and running various projects, inviting leading experts on questions of Ukrainian history, culture, and current affairs. The last 7 years have been extremely challenging for Ukraine, of course, but at the same time, they've also seen an extraordinary revival in the cultural sphere. Numerous theatre productions, exhibitions, cultural activity appeared, often in spite of the turbulent events that Ukraine is going through, including the war in Donbass, and sometimes also in response to this political upheaval. We have an excellent all-female panel of experts today to discuss the transformation of Ukrainian cultural policy, but also the transformative role of culture in Ukraine. And these speakers include the former director of the Ukrainian Institute London, Marina Pesenti, and Olesya Ostrovska-Lyuta, who's the general director of the Mistecki Arsenal National Arts and Culture Museum Complex. And they will get a proper introduction from our moderator in a minute, but let me now introduce the moderator. Kateryna Botanova is a cultural critic. She's also a journalist, curator, and policy analyst. And before joining Culturescapes, where she is now co-curator, she was director of Foundation Center for Contemporary Art in Kyiv. She's also founder and editor-in-chief of the online journal on contemporary art and culture, Corridor. She curated numerous projects, consulted and did research for a variety of European cultural institutions and programs, including Eastern Partnership Cultural Program. She contributes to a number of media outlets. So you can find her texts on websites such as Eurozine and Open Democracy. And Kateryna is also a member of PEN Ukraine. So certainly an extremely very well placed person to guide us through this discussion and contribute to it herself. Kateryna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olesya. It's a huge pleasure and huge honor to be joining you today and also moderating. It also seems to be that working in cultural field and also analyzing and writing about cultural policy and changes in Ukraine has been my job for the last, I would say, 25 years. And I often say that not many other things I can do than work in culture and write about culture. And I was very pleasantly surprised with the title of the discussion today about, cultural renaissance and revival in Ukraine. It seems to me that we in Ukraine is kind of not part of our cultural tradition to see the bright side, to really give a proper place and appreciate the changes and the positive sides rather than only challenges or only hardships. And if we look back some 5, 6, 7 years, we will see that the policies in cultural field in Ukraine did change a lot, and the institutions became much stronger and cultural actors acquired so much more possibilities. And maybe the most important, the gap between what used to be known as official and non-official or state-run and independent culture has definitely become smaller. I remember once some years ago, I was invited by the British Council of Ukraine to give an inspiration talk to our British curators and directors. They've been chosen to come to Ukraine to work in tandem with Ukrainian counterparts. My opening of the inspiration talk was, guys, forget everything you know about public funding and public support for independent institutions and initiatives. It just doesn't happen here. It just doesn't exist. And I must admit that the guys were really stunned. But then after the program ended, some of them were writing to me saying like, yeah, it was really helpful. I mean, we would never even think about it. So the changes have been there, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So let's look at cultural revival in Ukraine and what it means today. And I'm very happy to welcome first Marina Pesenti, who is the author of Cultural Revival and Social Transformation in Ukraine, a research paper commissioned by the Chatham House last year, which will be the core of our discussion today, and Marina will present it in a moment. Originally, Marina comes from Kiev. She's a graduate of Kiev Mahila Academy and holds a degree from the London School of Economics. She spent 10 years with the BBC World Service in London, producing and presenting programs. And she was a winner of BBC World Service Documentary Bursary Award and produced documentaries for English and Ukrainian desks. Marina has conducted research for think tanks, such as Legatum Institute in London and Kennan Institute in Kiev. She was the director of Ukrainian Investment Summit in London with Adam Smith Conferences and a freelancer for Bell Pottinger, a UK-based PR consultancy. And last but not the least, Marina was the director of the Ukrainian Institute between 2015 and 2020. And I'm also very happy to welcome Olesya Ostrovska-Lyuta, who is currently a director of the Mistecki Arsenal, National Arts and Culture Museum Complex in Ukraine. And she also graduated from Kiev Mahila Academy. And actually, I also graduated from Kiev Mahila Academy. We have a club here today. Olesya's previous experience includes working with the Foundation Center for Contemporary Art in Kiev as an assistant director, and the development of Ukraine non-for-profit foundation, where she was a manager of projects and programs. In 2014, right after Maidan, Olesya held the position of a first deputy minister of culture in Ukraine in the first post-Maidan government. And in 2016, she worked as a deputy director of the Promova Analytics Center, one of the important think tanks in Kiev. Since July 2016, Olesya joined the team of Mistecki Arsenal as a director and is on many boards of many cultural institutions and think tanks in Ukraine. So that's the introduction. I'm very happy to be a part of this great team of people today. And I'm very happy also to pass the word to Marina now for a presentation and the start of the talk.
Thank you, Kateryna. I'm delighted to attend this kind of like a graduation party of the former graduates of the Kiev Mahila Academy, but I'm especially delighted that we have such distinguished speakers on board who have really years and decades of experience of culture management in Ukraine. So talking about my paper, it's been mentioned that Ukraine has been through some significant changes in cultural policies and also through a noticeable revival of its arts and culture. And I'm sure many of you have witnessed what trickled down to Western audiences, especially in the UK, Ukrainian theatre productions, visual arts, cinema, films, and so on. So in my paper, I was trying to analyze what is so extraordinary about these changes and how did they come about. And as Kateryna mentioned, one of the most groundbreaking changes that Ukraine experienced was changing the whole infrastructure and creating the ecosystem for culture in Ukraine. And the efforts which were implemented were quite comprehensive. We talk about the establishment of three brand new cultural institutions and quite a thorough reform of the one kind of older cultural institution. And I would like our colleagues at Ukrainian Institute London to bring up a slide just to give you a visual image what these institutions are. I think probably some of you are familiar with some of them. They are really well known in Ukraine's arts and culture sphere. These are Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, Ukrainian Book Institute, Ukrainian Institute, and also Ukrainian State Film Agency. And actually, just looking at these logos, you can see that the logo of Ukrainian State Film Agency, which was set up actually quite a while ago, about, I think, more than 10 years ago, it looks quite different and probably reflects the attitude towards state institutions at the time. As you can see, it incorporates, Ukrainian national emblem, and it's quite formal in its approach, while the logos of three other institutions are really much more kind of hip and cool and really reflect this kind of turn towards, arts and culture community and the final users of the cultural products, which is, broad audience, you and me and us. So this is just kind of a, very visual, short commentary on what these institutions are. But behind this, there's really a groundbreaking change in how these institutions work. At the core, one of the biggest of these institutions is the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, which has the biggest budget. And this is the main grant-giving body in Ukraine for arts and culture. For those who operate in the UK, the equivalent would be Arts Council England. And some of the principles that Ukrainian Cultural Foundation established from the start are very similar to culture management principles in European and Western cultural context, which is an open access to state resources, which is accountability, horizontal networks, wide involvement of expertise, sectoral expertise, very clear rules and procedures how this monies are administered, and new principles of governance. So all these institutions have got supervisory boards, and they also have experts councils, as I mentioned, and they are very adapted communications, which is also quite new for the Ukrainian context. So how did this come about? But there's a constellation of several factors which really facilitated this. And there was this window of opportunity which emerged after Maidan. Luckily, there were several actors who came on board and facilitated the emergence of these institutions and this new ecosystem of culture. One of them is a very vibrant Ukrainian civil society, and I'm sure many of you have heard of a wide plethora of civil society institutions which exist across many areas, and the area of culture was one of them. And these cultural institutions actually proposed quite a comprehensive plan of change of cultural policies, and they initiated dialogue with state institutions promoting this new vision. In fact, both Kateryna and Olesya, they were directly involved into these initiatives. One of them was called Culture 2025, which was an NGO and also a document, comprehensive plan, what these changes should involve. And in the aftermath of Maidan, these cultural activists, they were quite forceful in trying to engage the state officials to take these changes on board, and even for a short period of time squatted on the premises of the Ministry of Culture and engaged the minister into those conversations. So what was the result of this? The result of this was that it established the principles of competitive selection of the managers of the Ukrainian state cultural institutions, and it also promoted evidence-based cultural policies. It should be explained, and I think we'll probably touch upon this in the discussion afterwards, that prior to that, there were very sporadic and very chaotic, if any at all, attempts of the state to formulate what its cultural policy was. And as Kateryna mentioned, there was this really enormous gap between the state and the cultural sector. The state continued funding creative unions, so-called creative unions, which was pretty much a Soviet tradition, and didn't introduce any kind of incentives for the state cultural institutions to adapt to the changing realities, to think about their audiences.
Sorry for this brief interruption. I now tried to connect through my phone. I hope it should be all right this time. So I was talking about several group of actors who helped to facilitate these changes in Ukrainian cultural policy. And I mentioned civil society, Ukrainian politician who supported the change. And finally, I'd like to talk about the external cultural relations organizations. And here we talk about organizations like British Council, Goethe Institute, European Delegation to Ukraine, Polish Institute, and many others. So these organizations have been present in Ukraine for a long time. They didn't necessarily lobby for cultural policy change in Ukraine as such. However, they created kind of the foundations for this change by providing mobility opportunities for Ukrainian cultural operators, co-productions. They encouraged co-productions, provided training, and eventually, step by step, this created an environment where more and more Ukrainian cultural actors became adept and knowledgeable in European cultural policies, practices. And interestingly, several of the people who worked for this cultural institutions later went on to lead the newly established cultural institutions in Ukraine. For example, Yulia Fediev, the executive director of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, she used to run the Creative Europe Bureau in Ukraine, and Volodymyr Sheiko, the director of Ukrainian Institute, also ran arts program at British Council. As I mentioned, there's a number of features which make these institutions quite unique. And I also would like to argue that this kind of systemic approach that the state finally supported was really timely at the moment when Ukraine had to fight a hybrid aggression against Russia. As we know, the conflict in Donbass started in 2014, and identity, memory were the cornerstones of this conflict. So this was hugely important that Ukraine managed to come up with a policy which encouraged cultural production, which increased manifold in Ukraine, and also helped to develop a sense of identity in Ukraine, which acted as a kind of counter balance against these Russian narratives vis-a-vis Ukraine. I will say just a few words about this discourse of identity before we move to the discussion, and I'm sure that's something that lots of people are interested in, and the role that culture played in this discourse of identity. As many of you are probably aware that in the aftermath of Maidan, Ukraine more and more is inclined towards talking of its identity in terms of civic identity, inclusive identity, rather than ethnic-based or language-based. And this is pretty much an approach which was adopted by these new institutions. For example, the strategy of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, they talk about this diversity and inclusivity, and it doesn't really demand of the applicants to promote some kind of patriotic content or peddle this patriotic content. So there's this strength in Ukraine about the fact that it has a variety of state measures which encourage, this identity building projects. As I said, new institutions, they promoted this more liberal discourse. On the other hand, there was a number of measures which were more protectionist and restrictive. And here I would like to mention that in the aftermath of Maidan, Ukrainian state imposed bans on the access of Russian cultural content, which still retains a lot of influence on Ukrainian viewers and readers in the sense that some Ukrainian Russian TV products, books, films were banned in Ukraine. And the effect of this was, contradictory. There was lots of criticism that, Ukraine resorted to these protectionist measures. On the other hand, there was also a certain consensus that it helped to shield Ukraine from this influence and to develop its own cultural production and its own cultural and identity narrative. I also would like to mention about the activities of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. That's another institution which I touch upon in my paper, which also played an important role in shaping the discourse on identity in Ukraine. And many of you probably is aware that this institution introduced so-called decommunization laws in Ukraine, which promoted a certain view on a prescriptive view on Ukrainian Soviet past and banned Soviet symbols this Soviet discourse on history in Ukraine. This is a complex topic, which I will try to round up in saying that despite this prescriptive nature of decommunization laws, they actually spurred, and I argue this in my paper, quite a lively discussion in Ukrainian society about what Soviet past actually means, and also certain cultural activism about safeguarding some, art projects of the Soviet period. So just to sum up what identity project and cultural production in Ukraine, how they interact with each other in the post-Maidan period, I just would like to say that Ukraine created a really diverse, pluralistic cultural space, helped by a variety of the state policies, some of them liberal, some of them rather protectionist. However, it created a really viable response to Russian hybrid threat. And I hope we will talk about this in more detail in the course of our discussion.
Thank you so much, Marina. I really hope we have enough time to touch upon all this. I mean, we definitely won't touch upon everything, but it's a very important paper, which I do encourage all of our everybody in the audience to read. It's very important to understand what is happening, what has been happening in the cultural domain in Ukraine in the last years. A short note on my side, just to highlight, which I find very important, that Marina highlights the important game changer, which was a key to successful changes in the policy making after Maidan, and that's the joining of three different forces, which is active civil society. And the important thing about the civil society at that moment, because it was also quite active before, is that, like with the Culture 2025, it was not actually an NGO, because it wasn't an NGO, it was an alliance of NGOs. So the civil society in Ukraine started to form alliances and horizontal networks to collaborate, to really bring up the issues that were important and be stronger together. And then the politics, basically, is also an important part of the political kind of landscape in Ukraine after Maidan, that in the parliament and also in the government, there were people with enough persuasion and with enough dedication to really make those ideas, those suggestions, those, papers into a political reality. And the third part is donors. The Western donors, which supported, especially in the very beginning, when the funds were so scarce, that really supported this changing process of debate and discussion and finding, or at least trying to find, the solutions that might work on. And I think it was a very, very particular moment in kind of in Ukrainian history, which enabled a lot of things that happened afterwards. But that's just my short comment, and I want to, pass the virtual mic to Olesya now.
Thank you, Katya. Good evening. I'm very happy to be here tonight with you. I'm very honored to be with such distinguished speakers. And I think Marina's paper is really brilliant, which shows a lot of connections and describes it very clearly what has been happening in Ukraine for the past few years. I would also like to highlight one thing which seems very important to me, and that is the role of bureaucracy or of new people in the government after EuroMaidan. And what happened after EuroMaidan? Some new people came to work for the state, which was not, of course, a mass movement. Those were rather individual figures, but those figures often created very strong alliances with civil society. Take my example, for example, I worked at the Ministry of Culture, but how I came to the Ministry of Culture, the newly appointed Minister of Culture, Evgen Nishchuk, called me and invited me to be his deputy as a result of a civil society pressure, because there was a certain pressure about my presence in the state bureaucracy. And again, that allowed to create that connection on one hand. On the other hand, it seems to me, and I've been working in the field of culture for over 20 years, so this is my observation from that point. It seems to me that this moment, 2014, was the first time when you had people in the government, and now I mean specifically Minister of Culture Evgen Nishchuk, for example, but also other people who had the idea of the mission, which was not the case, were very much focused on what their mission is, which was not the case previously. The mission was, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion in 2014 about why are we here? It was the same. There was the same debate in the Ministry of Education, where you had Serhiy Kvit and Inna Sovsun, for example. What's our mission? Why we try to do something in the government? And it was the first time that the answer was that the mission is to serve the society and to achieve changes within the society. Well, before, again, this is my rather individual view, but before I had the feeling that people saw their mission rather as serving the individual politicians or serving the bureaucracy itself, not the society, serving the state, and serving the state in the end accounted to serving either individual politicians or bureaucracy itself. That sounds, this all sounds like huge words. It sounds very abstract, but that was the spirit of 2014. This is why that was the ground, the basis of many debates and many steps at that time, which fueled really many changes. I would also like to mention one more very important player, which comes under the umbrella of donors, but stands aside a little bit, and that is International Renaissance Foundation, which is a branch of Soros Foundation. One of the, probably the oldest donor focused on civil society in Ukraine, who also had a cultural program in the 90s, including the Soros Center for Contemporary Art, where I worked, cultural program where Kateryna worked, for example, and also many other people. What happened? What was the impact of the Soros Foundation or Renaissance Foundation? They created a group of people with a different set of skills, who were already, they were not extremely young by the moment of EuroMaidan, which meant that they already had some experience in managing projects or institutions, but their experience was also very merit-based, with a focus on transparency, civil society engagement, and things like that. So that group of people was also very important in drafting further reforms. Now, Kateryna asked me previously about why the situation in the government, especially in the Ministry of Culture, was different from what Marina described prior to EuroMaidan. But it seems to me that one of the answers is very banal one, and that is change of generation. And by generation, I do not mean age, but rather approach to what culture actually is, and more importantly, what the role of the state and of public institutions is. Because as Marina has already mentioned, there was, and also Kateryna mentioned, that there was a huge gap between state culture sector, as it was called in Ukraine, never public sector, and independent sector. The public sector or the state sector, and those are, for example, museums, opera houses, theaters, was financed by public money, by the state, as we call it in Ukraine still. But it was also very tightly controlled. There was a lot of control of virtually everything, with no initiative from the grassroots level. while the independent sector, and there were two fields especially noticeable, and that is the field of literature and the field of contemporary art, were not regulated at all. Why they were not regulated? Because literature was never regulated by the Ministry of Culture in Soviet Union. Literature would stand aside, would stand alone, and contemporary art just did not exist as a scene, as a stage in Soviet times. So it developed after the collapse of Soviet times. So those fields were not regulated, and therefore you have all those big names in the aftermath, like Oksana Zabushko and Yuri Andrukhovich and Sergei Zhadan and many others. On the other hand, it was never supported. So the only support would come either from international donors or partners or cultural institutions of all kinds, or in the 90s, International Renaissance Foundation. But the independent sector were virtually invisible to the state. The state just did not recognize that they exist. So in 2014, the whole debate started that the international sector is actually no less important than state sector. And to be sure, museums and opera houses and theaters and philharmonic houses, they are also very important. So we should not underestimate their role. But it was just the beginning of bridging that gap between those two sectors. This gap almost does not exist anymore, in my opinion. There are still divisions, but it's nothing in comparison to what it was 6 years ago.
You know, Lisa, I think I want to highlight another gap which still exists, and I think it's interesting. It's the gap which is it still holds in the language, because we still call it a state support and state institutions and independent institutions. Although what we call state institutions or state support is first, I mean, if it's support, it's public because it's public money. And it gives a different sense of ownership in the language also, right? Public, which means, you know, it's also mine a bit. And also by calling everything, like the whole public sector as a state, which is the same in Ukrainian language, right? I mean, English is just translation from how it's used in the Ukrainian language. It means that all the nuances between the national or, you know, municipal, local institutions, funded or co-funded from, let's say, municipal budgets, they're all erased. And this is some kind of big bulk of a state, which is somewhere there, which basically reflects the attitude from those times that you, Olesya, were just saying. You know, the state is just someone, and independent means independent from the state. Basically, it means various forms of ownership, and sometimes it's not even institutions, it's groups of people, or, you know, it's activists, or it's artists, but it's still independent. And maybe it's important to also think about it. I mean, since our, you know, title of the talk and our goal today is to think of, you know, how to keep it going. And maybe one of the important things to think to help keep it going is to how we have to rethink the language which we use when we talk about those processes. But also, since we're talking about how to keep it going, it was very interesting note about the generation, right? Which is not the age notion, but sort of more experience and motivation and mission notion. Marina also writes a lot about this different type of managers that came into different institutions and also to the government. My question to how to keep it going, what happens when those people start to burn out? Because this is also a phenomenon of, you know, Ukrainian governments and governance in general, not just in culture, on all the levels from 2014, and it just grows in huge waves on, but also in cultural management, institutional management, people have to face such a harsh constraints and challenges, which is also the question, like, what exactly are they facing nowadays? That they just burn out, and we know, you know, they drop, the governments change, and people, motivated people, just disappear and go and do something else. What can be done about that, you think? Can we try to think maybe not of a recipe, but at least some kind of a positive approach of what can be done? Question to both Olesya and Marina.
Can I start possibly on this? I think, some managers of these new institutions, Yulia Fedev probably would be the one who would spring to mind because she's really widely respected for her skill and how she managed to lead an institution which has, at neck-breaking speed rolled out, this grant funding to so many cultural operators. But in my view, the danger is not so much the burnout. Should we say, is there a capacity inside Ukrainian cultural sector that there would be somebody else who would come and replace her? The tentative answer would be that probably yes. But it seems to me that the major danger that emanates, it comes from vulnerability of these institutions as such, and whether they could be hijacked by political forces or its institutional capacity undermined so that it's no longer the same institution that it is now. That is a much more, complicated question. And I think now it comes to the fore because we know that Yulia Fedev, for example, she's about to finish her tenure as director, and the question who's next comes up and is viewed by the creative community with some trepidation. The fact that Ukrainian Cultural Foundation managed to secure such a firm grounding with the Ukrainian creative community by issuing over 2,000 grants to various cultural organizations, but also legitimizing a huge volume of cultural expertise by attracting 500 experts to appraise those applications. Could this work as some kind of a guarantee that this institution will not be touched and will not be hijacked for political ends? I think that's a bit of an open question, and I would like to pass it on, possibly.
Well, if I may, I think this year, 2021, is a decisive year for all those reforms, because this is the year when we are facing the end of tenure of very many new directors in many institutions, starting with the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation and up to public broadcasting company, which is a huge player in Ukrainian both cultural and information, if you like, field, and also Ukrainian Institute and many other organizations. We'll see, because all those institutions are very fragile. They are large, such as Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. They have a lot of trust. But why are they trusted? It's also an interesting question, because this is one of the few examples in Ukraine during the past 30 years when you have an institution which promises and delivers what it promised. It's very, very rare. And this, you would think, quite a banal thing, is exactly the reason why this trust has been built for now. So they promised and they delivered. They promised, they deliver. That's important. And they do not hide information. They tell you openly what's going on, which is also quite new in Ukrainian governing practices. So this is the reason that those institutions, including Ukrainian Institute, and the Ukrainian Institute is an institution created by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote Ukrainian, I don't know how to say it, even to build more relations between Ukraine and other countries. That would be more correct. So all those institutions, they've been operating on this different approach, but all of them will have to go through competitions for new directors this year. And we will, this is a test year then, we will only see whether they are very fragile or whether they have some anti-fragility, if you like, if they can work on the same premises next period.
It's a very good point about the fragility, and in a second we'll go there. But before that, I wanted to ask everybody who is watching us and listening us today to put the questions in a Q&A box, because we are coming to the moment when we'll be really happy to take the questions and talk about what you want to talk about. So please do it. And back to fragility. Yeah, I do agree also that the competition, the open competition for the positions of director will be one important test. And actually, Marina also notes that in the paper, in the report, that the law, which was passed 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, which ensured, or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, ensured the open and transparent competition for the key positions in the cultural sector, which was not the case before. The people were appointed just by hand, by decision of the minister or the governing body, on the local level. It was really a key law, and very important law, ensuring the open access and ensuring this change of generation in the institutions. But that's only one important part of possible sustainability and stability of those institutions. What other factors you can see and you can name that are important for those institutions to not just to survive, but to develop and to deliver what they're supposed to deliver? And what role you see as, the cabinet of ministers in general, the government in general, but also the respective ministries, Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Culture and Information, as it is called now, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs in case of Ukrainian Institute. What role do these relations play, and how they should be built in the future to support those institutions, to make them stronger?
Well, let me start then. Well, I have a feeling that what is really needed and what still counts in Ukraine, there is public voice. And any form of public voice, both from the civil society, from larger audiences, from international community, from media as well, is extremely important in supporting those new institutions. When you have many supportive voices, and it doesn't have to be for individual director, although I think that Yulia Fedeva and Volodymyr Sheiko are doing really great job, and I respect their work very much. So it doesn't have to be in the individual director, but it has to be the institution, the principles of good governance, the principle of an effective institution, and effective for the sake of society, not for the sake of bureaucracy, let's say. That is important, that really counts, and that is heard. What is also important when it comes to the teams of those institutions, because you have living people working in those institutions under huge pressure. Because why this pressure is so huge? Because legislative infrastructure is absolutely contra those institutions. It constrains them on absolutely everything, on many things. And those institutions are actually changing this legislative infrastructure and legislative climate by their existence. So that's another important mission that they are doing. So those teams and those people working in those institutions, they need a lot of support as well, including, let me be blunt, even emotional support, because we all live in the environment of social media now. and people are really also very receptive to those public opinions. So that's another thing. These forms of support, and as of course political support from international community, including donor community, really counts.
I would like to point out that actually in the past year, which was the year of the pandemics, well, it still carries on, but Ukrainian cultural institutions actually presented a united front vis-a-vis the government, asking the government to be much more moderate in cutting their budget. And in fact, initial cuts were supposed to be much more drastic than they are now. So this is probably some evidence that, you know, this kind of talking in a single voice, these institutions and the support that they enjoy from the grassroots creative community would probably matter. I would like to make just a very quick point about the fragility of institutions in general. And just as an example, to bring up the British experience, for example, of the BBC, which now is under a lot of pressure from the ruling Conservative Party. And there are similar examples from Poland, for example, where leading cultural institutions are also under lots of pressure from the right-wing government. And, for example, the director of the Adam Mickiewicz Institute, who was removed because he didn't deliver Christian enough content for the government. This is just a demonstration that institutions are inherently fragile, and they are even more fragile in the environment which we have in Ukraine, of political instability, of cronyism. So this is something to watch, and we can remain hopeful that this will be a storm that these institutions will withstand.
Supportive.
Well, you know, looking at Poland and also at, you know, other neighbors of ours, or, you know, not so close neighbors like Hungary or recently Slovenia, yeah, certain tendencies don't look very, very hopeful and very positive. And I do hope that Ukraine and Ukrainian institutions, actually Ukrainian civil society, that's more important probably, can stand against such attempts of control and censorship. Which brings me to another question which is discussed in the paper, and which seem to be also important in, you know, in this overall framework of our talk. In the times of, you know, uncertainty, instability, and fragility, it was the Western donors that played quite a crucial role in supporting cultural organizations and changes, and kind of being a, let's put it mildly, an incentive to, you know, politicians to work towards change. Both of you, you know, analyzed, or, you know, in Olesya's case, work with many Western donors, you know, over the course of years. What would you name as the most important changes in attitudes, in approaches of this major institutions towards Ukraine and Ukrainian kind of cultural community? And what does it mean for Ukrainian cultural community, for Ukrainian cultural domain?
I think the important change that I have witnessed in those cultural institutions, namely Goethe Institute and British Council, for example, they switched from presenting their national culture to creating collaborations and strong, long-lasting ties between individuals and organizations. And that was extremely, extremely helpful. That's second, that other change of policy, the change of policy was very helpful. And this is more or less how Ukrainian Institute is modeling its activities and programming now, which I think is a very good sign as well. And there was one thing. And another thing, that those institutions were also very helpful in creating longer inter-institutional connections, not only between creators, but also between institutions. But if you ask me what needs to be done, how Ukrainian cultural scene should be supported, I think that this is one thing, helping to create contacts not only between people, but also between institutions. Because collaborations need resources. Collaborations are investment, and Ukrainian institutions often are not capable of investing for a long time. And to have a meaningful collaboration, you have to invest for a few years to come to something deeper and more sound. And this is why Ukrainian institutions are weak usually.
I think I probably will pass this around because I totally agree with the points that Olesya has made.
Then before moving to questions, which we have a few, I wanted to introduce another perspective and another part of kind of geopolitical and cultural framework where Ukraine exists, because I do think it's very important to see the processes that are happening in Ukraine also, in the context of what happens, to the west and to the east of Ukraine, and to do different perspectives. What I mean now is that looking from the west, Ukraine, especially in political terms, and culture is not an exception there, Ukraine is often seen as a part of Eastern Partnership, which is Eastern neighborhood of the European Union that consists of six countries, which is Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and the three countries of South Caucasus, which is Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And there is a tool in European Union called Eastern Partnership Culture Program, a very successful, very important tool, which was developed in 2009 and was launched in 2011 to support the changes and to strengthen the policies and the civil society in those countries to support the cultural sector. At the start of this program, and I was at the start of the program, I was one of the experts sort of analyzing the needs of the region. The needs were, maybe a bit surprisingly, maybe not, quite similar. So as of 2009, you still had a lot of these very diverse countries. You had over-bureaucratized, corrupt government, extensive crumbling network of cultural institutions, including, houses of cultures and libraries and theaters in a quite poor condition. Outdated artistic unions, still kind of having a legacy from the Soviet times of tool of ideological control, something which Olesya was mentioning. Literature was controlled through the union, not through the ministry. And quite active, but also quite weak non-governmental sector. So the tools were developed to work, with the six countries, with a similar approach, with the similar experts coming, and doing the workshops and working. And 10 years later, or 11 years later, we see quite a difference. What is the difference? What sets Ukraine and Ukrainian practices as of today apart from kind of our neighbors, let's say, our colleagues in Eastern Partnership?
Maybe I could start. I just would like to bring up the example of Poland that we've just mentioned. And in fact, it's quite remarkable because this country has been an EU member for quite some time and, should be having a very deeply entrenched traditions of culture management. But as it shows, the issue of political pressure is there. And it turned out to be a decisive factor, which is now working towards crushing these established practices. But when we look at Eastern Partnership countries, we can see that they followed pretty similar, as you said, they had similar issues. However, Ukraine managed to move a little bit step ahead with rolling out these new institutions and establishing a system of open state support for the arts community. So that's something that quite puts it apart. What's actually interesting in this context that across the whole Soviet space, when we talk about Russia and its which cultural policies does it pursue, we will notice that actually any kind of dialogue that could exist between culture professionals, between Ukraine, Georgia, let's say Baltic countries, and Russia, it seems that this conversation is not happening. Certainly, we see very little sign of this in Ukraine, which is quite an evidence that Russia pursues its own part And probably there are lots of indications that it is still within the paradigm of using culture as weapon, as soft power, to promote, project its political influence rather than thinking of culture as cultural relations.
When you ask what was the difference, what is this factor that made it a little bit different from other countries, I would not be very original, would say that EuroMaidan was a very important changing point. And once again, I will sound a little bit grandiose, but this spirit of the mission of serving the society was very important after EuroMaidan, and that really gave a lot of drive to many decisions. So EuroMaidan as a kind of step where you step on it and then you go was a very important historical moment for Ukrainian cultural scene. That is one thing. And another thing is the civil society and plurality of media. We do have, in Ukraine, you do have many voices, although many television stations, as we all know, are oligarch control, but they do promote different agendas. And you also had many electronic media, including all the one like Ukrainska Pravda, who's been there for a very long time, giving you an alternative view. So again, that all helped to create this diverse context in which different new things could arise.
Thank you, and I'm very glad that we have questions and comments, which means that we're not just talking to each other, we'll be talking to other people. And I'm happy to welcome Verliana Tkac, who is a theater director, and if I'm not mistaken, who was the director of the production, which image from which served as an image for promoting the Marina's paper and this event. Please, Verliana, you have a mic.
Good afternoon or evening from New York. So I was really delighted that the image was used, and thank you. At first I was a little, it was a production I did with Nova Opera, Opera Gaz at Mistetsky Arsenal, so many things in common here. And at the same time, kind of taken aback that, our names were taken off, etc. But, and how Eurocentric this whole paper was. But then as I read it, it made more sense in terms of it was speaking to the European community. Even though most of the projects mentioned, be it Izolasya, be it, Q, be it Gogol Fest, be it Reform, are certainly things I've taken part in. And that's always come with, or on my part, I've always made huge efforts so that we bring some funds into that from the American crowd, US Embassy. I think especially important to the Ukrainian scene in terms of what Olesya was talking about, really training a new group of people to talk about bureaucracy and art in Ukraine, has been the Fulbright program also, I think, which has introduced lots of nuance to that situation, I think, in a whole different way. So I just wanted to make that comment more than anything else. And also just the availability of funds from North America, not so much governmental funds even maybe as the private money that's come in to help support various projects and organizations. The change in Ukraine is stunning, and not only I can talk about the change from 1991 when I first tried to do a co-production with the Ukrainian theater. It is unbelievable, almost. The first thing I learned on my first project was, if they say they're from the government, walk the other way, you know, because you will only get ripped off. That was, you know, it's a whole different ballpark now. And I really appreciate the change, and I really appreciate the change that everybody else has put into it. But I think the most important point was one of the last ones made, which is, it is the collaborative work that has to happen. And that's kind of where we started, but you know, you kind of begin to come back very often to the point that you have to come back to, which is, it is personal relationship between artists that makes arts grow, but it also personal relationship between the institutions that makes the institutions grow, both ways. And the experience, you know, of continuing, knowing that you will be there in the next 10 years. So not so much a question as a comment, I guess.
Thank you very much for your comment, Rilana. And you actually brought me to a thought, which, I mean, there's something which I realized only recently, that so Olesya mentioned I worked in the Soros Foundation as a head of a cultural program at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000. It is private money, is American private money, and it was the first and the biggest funder in Ukraine in culture at the time when no other funding was available. And the interesting thing that I really noticed just recently, that money came without a programmation. So the question was, you guys decide, you brainstorm, you know, you work with a cultural society. I mean, for cultural program for sure, but as far as I remember, it was the same for other programs. And you decide what priorities and what programs you need to run. And then of course they have to be confirmed by the board. But basically, it was a very early exercise of collaborative action and brainstorming about the needs and possibilities and the ways that the Ukrainian cultural community could see about yourself. And I think it's very important. It's with majority of Western donors ever since, but up till sort of now, recently, this didn't happen. They would come with their own agenda, which is also great. And then there would be a negotiation between, you know, the agenda and the Ukrainian actors. That's my little comment to your comment. Thank you. And I think we have...
Can I make one thing? That for me, the difficult part is sometimes understanding the rules of the game now, you know, in terms of like, I find it impossible to apply for, as an international person or a project, you know, for collaborative work to any of the Ukrainian funds. Not necessarily that we need to be funded, but even to create a bureaucracy to deal with that, you know, or a way to deal with the budget, etc. Or like, for instance, for the translation project, they're just, you know, we have different Ukrainian language skills, not only even some of the English stuff that's translated. It is impossible for us to apply, basically. And I've been told this over and over and over and over again. Olesya and I tried to do it with us when we were doing the Kurbas project. It is literally impossible for us to do it.
I think Marina had this point, or right in this direction in your report. Am I right?
No, I don't think I specifically touched upon this, but it's true that the granting program is not exactly geared towards non-residents.
Right, and I'm not talking necessarily even in receiving the funds as such, but just making that collaboration a legal possibility, you know, is really hard.
May I add on that? As I already mentioned, that those institutions such as Ukrainian Cultural Institution, Ukrainian Institute, Ukrainian Book Institute, they are changing legislation, the legislation context by the activity, because They come to obstacles all the time. They hear opinions such as Virlana has expressed, and then they go and negotiate it with the parliament and the ministries. But it's a very long, very painstaking process. So this is another thing they are doing. But what we all have to understand that we are operating, all Ukrainian institutions, including those systematic ones, we all operate in a very outdated, often obscure legislative context, where we are prohibited from many things that are perceived as natural by our partners in other countries.
And on that level, perhaps having liaisons specifically for that purpose would be well worth considering. You know, people.
I hope this talk will be also at a certain moment maybe turn to a few recommendations, and I hope we can also take that into account. Thank you, Virlana. I'm sorry that I have to interrupt you, but we have a few more questions and not very much time left. I was very happy to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. And please, William Blacker, I hope I pronounced your name right. You're welcome to speak, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for such an interesting discussion. And yeah, I'll just echo what Virlana was saying. It's been so encouraging and wonderful to see the growth of these institutions in the last few years in Ukraine. It really kind of gives a lot of optimism. But my question is about kind of self-interested question in a way, as someone who works in a university in the United Kingdom who specializes in Ukraine. And it's about the role of universities, higher education institutions outside of Ukraine in the promotion of Ukrainian culture. The universities are, for a start, they're the places which will produce the future cultural professionals who will be able to engage with Ukrainian culture. And that can be, anybody from journalists to curators to whatever, but I'm thinking specifically about translators. Translation is mentioned in the report, and it's a really important thing to have translators translating Ukrainian literature, and there's been a kind of lack of that over the years, and we're seeing a bit more recently, but and it's really good that we have the New Translation Prize, and we have grants now being given, which is fantastic. But you need people who speak Ukrainian, and there are very few universities outside of Ukraine where the Ukrainian language is taught. So in the United Kingdom, there are 2 universities. The entire country, there are 2 universities where you can learn Ukrainian. One of them is University College London, where I work, and the other is Cambridge. There's one university which has a degree program in Ukrainian studies, and that's University College London, where I work. So unless some investment, some efforts are made on that front, there will always be this lack of translators on one hand, but just graduates going into the spheres of cultural institutions, cultural diplomacy, etc., who with a knowledge of Ukraine and the Ukrainian language. So I'm wondering where you see the role of the state in promoting that engagement with higher education institutions. What I've seen, for example, the program in Cambridge, which is is a great program, but this is funded by private Ukrainian money, not by the state. At my university, we've had very little contact with the Ukrainian state at all. We also had no, until last year or 2 years ago, we had no exchange programs with any Ukrainian university. So we set one up with the Ukrainian Catholic University, but I don't know if there are even any other universities which have exchange programs with Ukrainian.
Sorry to interrupt, can I ask you to go to questions that, we can answer, and please.
Yeah, of course. So
a bit of time pressure.
In your opinion, what can the Ukrainian state do in order to facilitate these processes?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Maybe I could have a quick take on this, because I, as a former director of Ukrainian Institute London, I had experience of running Ukrainian language school, which still exists as part of the institute. As you probably know, there are some attempts being done by the State Ukrainian Institute to promote the learning of Ukrainian language worldwide. However, this is a work which is still in very early stages, and it seems to me that the budget of the State Ukrainian Institute, which I think this year is going to be even smaller than in previous years, doesn't give us much hope that this program will be rolled out on a scale that to meet, the demand and to meet the needs. It seems to me that at least there should be some kind of collaboration between several state institutions, such as Ukrainian Institute, maybe somebody from the side of the Ministry of Education, but certainly they should also work with private actors, such as Ukrainian Catholic University, which has developed a wonderful manual of Ukrainian language, and which I think still has problems with securing funds to develop more quality literature, which could then be distributed. And also, I think that Ukrainian diaspora should play, more active role in this. But it should really be a broad stakeholder engagement, and the Ukrainian state should be driving this to include all these players to run the fundraising campaign, decide on the priorities, and yes, to make this happen.
Olesya, do you have a...
Yes, there is also a new body similar to Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, which was funded by the Ministry of Education, but it has not started to work really actively yet. It's called National Fund for National Research, if I'm correct in translating. But they're a little bit more conservative and they're not so fast as Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, but they are expected to fund also humanities, not only science, not only experimental science. So maybe they could be one of the institutions to watch. And it's also Ukrainian Institute, whose mission also includes learning Ukrainian. But as Marina has mentioned, their funding has been reduced this year, but this year is not the end of life, I hope. And what is important is advocating for the need of this program, meaning, contacting people, expressing this need, expressing readiness to cooperate. That would be an argument for Ukrainian Institute as well.
Thank you, Olesya and Marina. I think it's an important really thing in the context of our talk to highlight once again that not just the intention, but the strategy of, let's say, Ukrainian Institute is there in place, and the collaboration and support of Ukrainian study programs in different universities all around the world is there. But to make it actually happen, from the strategy to implementation, it needs support and funding, from the ministry, from the government. And this is one of the questions which will always be there. And the institutions will be strong to the extent that they are funded and supported, because you can have a beautiful strategy, but with no funds, it's not going to happen. So it is not the end of the world, and there is a hope that Ukrainian Institute can roll its strategy the way has been planned. I have two questions for you that I will read from Irina Marchuk. One in two parts is, I think it's about our discussion about state, non-state, independent actors. Where do you position Kovcheg Ukraina initiative, right? Kovcheg Ukraina, and Youth Orchestra of Ukraine. And another one is a follow-up question is also the build-up of institutional memory, which is so vital.
The interesting projects, especially Kovcheg Ukraina, has been, as far as I know, has been supported by the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. That's why it could happen. It's great, and this is one of the again symptoms of this great diversity and this renaissance that we are talking about.
Yes, I think Olesya answered the question about Kovcheg. I'm not much familiar with the Youth Orchestra of Ukraine, so I probably will skip that. Well, I think the organizations, institutions that we discussed today, they are still very young, so they are still kind of in their infancy. you know, the kind of practices that they have built really give us a lot of hope that this will continue. And if it does, it would be absolutely fantastic for the Ukrainian ecosystem of culture. However, it would be interesting to talk about Ukraine State Film Agency in this respect, because it's a much older institution, cultural institution, which I think is more than 10 years old. You probably, some of you might have heard that recently this institution has been in the center of some controversy following the appointment of its new head, Marina, who is criticized by Ukrainian cinematic community as not being quite a person with sufficient experience, and that her appointment was not transparent enough. And subsequently, the most recent rounds of funding at the Ukrainian State Film Agency was also seen by many actors as not being transparent. And why I'm talking about this, because talking of institutional memory, before these events happening, Ukrainian State Film Agency went through a very successful and productive 5 years of its existence between 2014 and 19, when it really revamped itself and launched very clear and productive guidelines for distributing funding for film production, initiated co-production, and as a result, Ukrainian film industry really boomed. I mentioned in my paper that from some 15 or 20 films which were produced over the years before this kind of outburst, Ukraine managed to produce more than 170 films. And actually, I should mention the figure of Philip Ilyenko, who was the head of the Ukrainian State Film Agency and really pioneered all these changes. So this is just a demonstration of the issue, just how precarious and how vulnerable these institutions are, and that this institutional memory, it is kind of there, but it's very difficult to lose it. And we require really lots of factors to come together and to work in unison to preserve the sustainability of these institutions.
Thank you, Marina. We have 5 minutes left and 2 more questions, which will come in person with a camera. So I invite now Marta Farayon, and I really ask both our attendees to be quick with a question and our panelists be quick with answers, that we stay on time. Please, Marta.
So I wanted to say it's great to see you, and thank you for the very valuable work you're doing, because this is work that brings really value to the image of Ukraine in the world. So we can talk a lot about everything that's going on. It's a very exciting subject and something that can help Ukraine's international image. But while it is important to provide cultural institutions the strength to develop their capabilities, how do you view international cultural diplomacy as a potent element in improving Ukraine's image in the world and to become a real force to build the country's brand? Culture is really a very strong, important element to build up a nation's reputation in the world. And that includes to improve even political relationships and the image of economic potential for the country. And I view
Thank you, Marta. I'm sorry for interrupting. We have very little time left, and yes, it's a huge question, very important one. So shortly, but let's address it and answer. Please, Marina and Olesya.
I think I would probably pass the floor to Olesya, because she's sitting on the supervisory board of the Ukrainian Institute, so she's really an insider.
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, this is one of the very clear ideas, both within the Ministry of International Affairs and the Institute itself and the cultural scene. So everyone understands the importance of international relations, but how it is seen today more It's rather cooperation and collaboration between individuals and organizations, with then just presenting your nice facade to other countries, to publics in other countries. And a lot is being done both by the Ukrainian Institute and Ukrainian Cultural Foundation and Ukrainian Book Institute. We at Art Arsenal are also trying our best. For example, we are working on a huge exhibition of Belarusian art to open in March. And we also see it as an important part of building stronger cooperation with, not with the West, but with a very important neighbor as well. But where our weakness is, I would like to stress it once again, Ukrainian organizations do not have enough resources, are very weak in securing resources for longer investment into longer projects. To have a project, to have a meaningful cooperation, you need to work for a couple of years towards it. And this is exactly where we are not very strong.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Olesya. And a very, very last question from Robert Rinkley. And Robert, we would appreciate if you'll be very, very concise with the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great discussion from the panel. Thank you. My question is, how important has been the contribution by rich Ukrainians, private Ukrainians, to reviving culture in Ukraine? And I'm thinking of people like Victor Pinchuk and his work for contemporary art. That's something that really hasn't been discussed so far.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Please.
I could probably say very quickly, because we haven't got much time. Indeed, Victor Pinchuk and his Center for Contemporary Art has been quite instrumental in promoting contemporary art in Ukraine and also establishing curatorial expertise, because he ran programs to develop curatorial skills among Ukrainian culture managers. And also his art center used to be the, if I could say, a lead manager for presenting Ukrainian contemporary art at the Venice Biennale for a number of years. That's, very, very briefly. Maybe Olesya would like to.
Do you have a short comment? Well, very short.
Yes, I do hope that the rich Ukrainians would do and will do more in the field of culture. For example, there are new players, very important ones arising, such as Zagori Family Foundation. They are doing a good job, and there is also Very Music Foundation, a foundation by Verevsky family who funds music. So more is arriving. That's good. And what is also good, that they establish their practices on the level of good governance. They try to do things transparent and merit-based. That's nice, but we will only see the outcomes in a couple of years, I think.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all participants, for being with us and listening and asking questions. Thank you a lot, Olesya and Marina. It was a great discussion. I personally enjoyed it a lot. And there were a few questions that we didn't address because we didn't have time, but one of them was about the evidence-based decisions, in the future policy making. And I hope that there will be more research and more reports done by Marina, done by other people to actually build and grow this evidence base. It's very much needed.